to a more sexy part of the conference. The scope of astrobiology is something that is more global, is more general than just to study the physical and chemical processes that predate the appearance of life. So we thought that in the astrobiology school we would have to have also people talking about the actual life process and the rules that control the change and the evolution of life. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ronaldo Fernandes. He actually started studying with me in astronomy in Rio de Janeiro. And 3 years later, he went to biology. So he, by formation, has already a pretty interesting global view of the subject of astrobiology. From there, he went to finish his PhD in Texas, University of Texas in '95 with Campbell, Dr. Campbell, on quantitative biology. I might add, he actually finished in a record-breaking time, 2.5 years, which shows it's not just capacity of how good the city was. And he came here to Rio in '96, next year, and is a professor of herpetology at the Museum of Natural History, University of Rio. So,
thank you, Ronaldo. And thank you for the observatory for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll talk a little about evolution. And because there is tomorrow a talk from my friend Mario Pina, I decided to talk not generally about evolution, but something that is close to my kind of research. So I decided to talk about sex. In particular, I want to talk a lot about sexual selection, which will come further in this talk. But to give you an idea about what biologists think about sex, we have to talk about how it came and what's the relevance actually in evolution. So let's go. Well, because Ronaldo talked so much about the fact that I was an astronomy major early on, I decided to start with a take on astrobiology. And I want to talk to you how life shapes planets. It's kind of curious that people don't think much about it. I hope you do. People concentrate a lot on the impact that the human species do on the planet, and it's quite extensive. Like it shaped the terrain. We change the terrain of the Earth all the time. Brazilians know about that. We change the composition of the atmosphere. In particular, we think about pollution, but we do a lot more. Let's go fast for this. We increase the acidification of the oceans, and there's a lot of impact in life. Every kind of corals and everything that uses calcium, it's kind of being destroyed by the change of the acidification of the ocean. And finally, we add new materials to the surface. And again, we mine a lot of stuff, and we process these things. However, human interference is not necessary. I mean, if you look at the planet, and you can see that life changes a lot. So vegetation shaped the land the way we know. If you see this photograph, we see a river. I mean, rivers, the way they are kind of determined, the trajectory is determined by the vegetation. Vegetation changes the soil, and the soil will shape the form any river goes. Photosynthesis changes the atmosphere by fixing CO2 and freeing O2. As far as I know, there is no other planet with a lot of oxygen, free oxygen in the atmosphere, and that's the result of photosynthesis. And matter of fact, before photosynthesis started, Earth was probably very high in CO2 in the atmosphere. And oxygen in the atmosphere changed the minerals. Most of the minerals we know today are the oxidation of something. This is chlorite. It's an oxidation of lead and uranium. And there are about 2,500 minerals in Earth, and most of them are oxidation process of something. And matter of fact, we can talk about what happens with Earth if life becomes extinct. Without photosynthesis, CO2 will quickly accumulate, so the atmosphere will change to mostly CO2, and the greenhouse effect will rise temperatures and the sea level. Moreover, without vegetation, the soil will become barren very quickly. And it's not very different from Mars, actually. if you have no vegetation. And again, if you have a greenhouse effect, it'll take a few million years, but probably the temperature will increase, and perhaps we get a positive feedback, and the atmosphere may look a lot like Venus, for example. So those are two, as far as we know, lifeless planets, and we can see that without the impact of life, Earth could easily become one of those. So let's go and talk a little bit about evolution, and I have to talk about some concepts. Well, evolution is a change of heritable characteristics. What I mean about that, in successive generations. There's a lot of ways we can see evolution, and probably people are more used to the way Darwin talked about that in the mid-19th century. But actually, how we do now is that we look at the frequencies of genes in the populations, and every time that they change, we say that that is evolution. Because if there was no evolution, those frequencies would be stable. And as such, there is an evolutionary mechanism that increase or decrease variation in the populations over successive generations. Mechanisms such as natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, genetic hitchhiking, or genetic flow. I believe Mario tomorrow will talk a little bit about those, but I can give you a preview of them. I'll talk a little bit more later. Mutation. Mutation is a main source of variation. Radiation just impacts the DNA we have and changes. So molecules will change and we have variation created by it. Most of these mutations are not harmful or advantageous. They're neutral. But yet, from time to time, some of those mutations can be sorry about that. It did not work. Turn this off. Doesn't matter.
I'll take that for you.
I think I just turned it off. Well, I'm saying that mutation is a source of variation. It's increased variation because it changes the molecules of DNA. They change the genes themselves. Although most of these mutations are neutral, sometimes some of them can be advantageous or deleterious. Genetic drift is a stochastic mechanism. Just by probability it's possible that some genes will become more frequent or less frequent with time. And it's more important if you have smaller populations. If you have an infinite population, of course, this is minimal. But what usually happens is that when evolution occurs, the population is not that big, so genetic drift can be important. Genetic hitchhiking is sort of a stochastic process. Exactly what happens is because of the morphology of the chromosomes. Sometimes the genes that have hitchhiking, they're just close to genes that are being naturally selected. And because they're close, naturally selected, their frequencies highs together with the genes being selected just because they're close by. And genetic flow is the way that genes moves through populations. Imagine that you have a population at a continent and another population in an island. The population in an island will be somewhat isolated from the continent. So in time, they have different frequencies that we have in the continent. But if they're not that far, some time to time, some individuals will cross the bridge between the continent and the island. And by bringing their different genes, they will create what we call a genetic flow that will, how to say in English, that a genetic flow that will contaminate the island. So they will have different genes that we usually don't have there. This is very relevant in the process of time that these barriers, they can grow or go away. If you see Earth in a geological scale, you see that the barriers can come and go. Like in the last glaciation, the ice covered most of the Earth, and by that the sea level were lower. So there were new places that we can cross between continents that are not closed because of the water rise. So genetic flow can be interesting too. And finally, there is natural selection. I think I have a slide about natural selection. Yes, I do. Natural selection is the more commonly known. It was originally introduced in 1859 by a joint presentation of Wallace and Darwin, and elaborated in 59 by the Origin of Species. So what's about? Oh, here is the Origin of Species. The idea of natural selection is based on those three things. There is phenotypic variation, differential fitness, and heritability of fitness. Okay, what's phenotypic variation? I talk a little bit about genetic variation. Genetic variation is cool, but it doesn't matter to natural selection because your genes do not determine what you are. Actually, what happens is that the genotype interacts with the environment and creates what we call the phenotype. That's the result of that. So, if you take the idea of having, let's say, twin brothers, they have the same genotype, but if you raise them under different circumstances, they can grow very differently. If you imagine that you feed them, you feed them well, let's say, among, I don't know, in a developed country, and the other one you send to Bangladesh or something like that, they will result very differently. That's the extreme case. But phenotypic variation result of that. And we can test it, and we did test it. You can take a lot of animals and you change the conditions, and the populations will change accordingly. So natural selection works on the phenotypic variation. They have to have variation of any kind. And then we have the second component, that's a differential fitness. What's fitness? Fitness is a complicated concept. Fitness is the idea that you're optimizing something. In the case of natural selection, what we talk is that some will perform better than others. And how will we measure the performance? We measure performance by the reproduction. And we have the idea of that fitness is heritable, which means that if you have more fitness, you have more descendants. And the descendants will inherit your own fitness. That's fundamental. At the time that Darwin proposed those things, there was no clue about heritability, how it works. So if you read Darwin's book today, it's kind of strange because he had no idea how inheritability works, but it needed to have this theory. So basically we have variation, and over this variation, some individuals perform better than others. And this better performance is inherited by their descendants. So the idea of natural selection is that because the performance is better by some individuals, they outperform the others and they will raise more descendants. And eventually, those descendants, they will be more numerous than descendants of the poorer fitted individuals. So the gene frequency will change in the population, and the fitness will rise.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
When you say fitness and performance, it's only with respect to the ability to get descendants, right?
Exactly.
So it could be, I could have a gene that I kill myself when I'm 30 years old, a shot in the head, but the same gene that makes me kill myself makes me more fertile at the age of 20. So the killing myself
so
at
it's
20
irrelevant.
make me more
So
fit.
it's irrelevant.
Okay.
Because the way we measure fitness is based on descendants.
That's the only thing that matters.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter if you kill yourself after you reproduce. I mean, you did your job.
Right, but my question was...
By the way, you didn't do your job, I know.
Well, that's actually what happens to many diseases. They're pushed to later stages of life.
Exactly.
Those are the stages that were less selected over time. So they're just genes that have positive effects when they're young, but their negative effects have been pushed by natural selection towards the end of life.
Oh, that's happened.
Past reproduction.
That happens a lot, and it's cool about that. That's because it creates a disease that only affect when you're actually weaker. What was irrelevant just a few decades ago. However, with medicine go up and we live more, they become more and more relevant. So sometimes people kind of complain, say, hey, it seems that have more disease now than ever. Well, people live more, and some of those can happen because of that. But what I'm going to talk about today is a special case of some natural selection. And it was in the 1859 book on the origin of species, but it's much more detailed in this further book, The Descent of Man. This book is a weird one. You see, it was published 12 years later, and here I think about more than half the book, about 2/3 of the book, is about what he called asexual selection. Okay, but the name of the book is Descent of Man, so you can imagine it having an impact on the Victorian society. I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'll go further this later, but let's talk about sex a little bit. Why individuals have sex? I mean, what do they use of that? I mean, I'm pretty sure you have all ideas about how sex is important in your life, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking is why? You see, if you are a bacteria, you have no sex, and you have some surplus of energy, and it's a good time to reproduce. You just, split yourself in two. You're done. Great. But if you're human, it's kind of complicated. You have to find a mate. You have to somehow seduce the mate, convince the mate to have sex with you. If you're a man, then it's not that bad because then you're done. But if you're a woman, you consume a lot of energy because then you have to, to bear the child. You have to raise the children somehow. That's a lot of energy. So in the end, you see, your children have one sex only. So they have to go to all this trouble again. So the output is 50% of what you have if you have a sexual reproduction, and it costs more and more energy. So why you have sex in the first time? And that's not an easy question. This is a lizard that, Amívula nativa, it's a lizard from the Espírito Santo and Bahia. It's a cool lizard. It's a portogenetic lizard. Lizards, some lizards do that. The population consisted only of females, and they reproduce by themselves. They don't need anything else. And I'm not sure if this lizard, they show how that happens, but usually when you have a portogenetic lizard, they need some stimuli to reproduce. So another female will just go, yeah, it's kind of strange. The other female will just go and cover this female, kind of like if a male would do, and this stimulate this female, and she's starting with her new egg. That's how it works. Yeah, it's kind of weird. But anyway, this population have only females. And
protogenetic?
No,
parthenogenetic. And the thing is, if you go there and sample those populations, and this one is pretty new, this was described 10 years ago, so I checked yesterday. There is no genetic studies, no comprehensive genetic study about that. But what you usually have with those species, either you have half a dozen lineages. I mean, they're all sisters, They have half a dozen lineages of half a dozen genotypes, and that's it. So there's not much variation. That's interesting. So perhaps variation, and you need variation to do natural selection. So perhaps it's a good hint about why sex exists. I mean, you may need variation. We'll talk about that. So it's a partnerized species, individual females. So the fun thing is that compared to other similar species, they produce about twice the number of females of a sexual species. So even if they have less variation, they're much more efficient. So my question is, why bother? Funny thing is that near all eukaryotes are sexual species. And by eukaryotes, if you don't remember, the living beings that have a nucleus, which most that we know. I mean, forget about viruses and bacteria, almost everything else is an eukaryote. We have a nucleus, okay? And we checked that, and well, some like some protozoans and some fungi don't have sex, but have something similar. Like they produce a number of mating types, so they divided their DNA the same way we do. And although they don't have sex, they do have something similar. So let's count them. And we believe today that most, if not all, asexual eukaryotes, there are a few of them, they're descendants of sexual species. What means that, and I think Mario will talk about that, that we have a characteristic that's sex, and sex appeared in the beginning of the eukaryotes, and it was lost later. they were reversal. And so, but anyway, we believe that the eukaryotes originally are sexual beings. And consider that sex needs a lot of energy. It's likely to be related to the origin of the eukaryotes, which is about the time the O2 will be freely available. And that's interesting, because let's look at those primitive eukaryotes. This is Trichomas giensa. Is Parabidont, I think. I forgot the name of this thing. Those are among the most basal eukaryotes. I mean, descendants of the most basal eukaryotes. Very primitive ones. And eukaryotes, I told you that they have nucleus across the ears. These will have some flagellum also. But the fun thing about that is not only the nucleus, they have a lot of stuff also. They have a cytoskeleton. They have a lot of internal membranes. They have a very complex cell. I mean, it's kind of strange to talk about complex, but compared to a bacteria, this is a very complex organism. And all this costs energy. Luckily to them, they also have mitochondria. Mitochondria is a structure inside the cell that was probably absorbed somehow. We don't know exactly how this happened, but mitochondria has their own DNA. We have mitochondria in all our cells, and that's where respiration goes. It's a very efficient method. It takes, it concentrates energy in molecules that we call ATP. If you can break them, it's a very energetic reaction, and so that's the fuel that burns in our physiology as a whole. So this appears with eukaryotes, the mitochondria. How we have it? One idea is that we phagocytated them. There were not different organisms, and it was phagocytated by the eukaryotes, by the primitive eukaryotes, the proto-eukaryotes. Problem is that to phagocytate anything, you have to have a cytoskeleton, which is already very costly in terms of energetic needs. So it's very muddy. We don't know exactly how this happened. At the same time, some eukaryotes also absorbed another structure that would do photosynthesis, probably in a similar process. We're not sure how this happened. But all this happened about 2.5 billion years ago. And that's the time that the Earth changes. But because with the eukaryotes, you first time have photosynthesis. And with photosynthesis, oxygen becomes freely available. Actually, there's some bacteria can do photosynthesis, so oxygen was free before that. But with the eukaryotes, oxygen becomes much more free, so we have much more energy in the environment. And so, sorry?
Just a question, is it 2.5 billion?
No, it's 2.7 if you really want to pinpoint this. But
right, so my question is, there is evidence that they know that they already had mitochondria in them. So
oh yes.
That means the mitochondria predates...
It's about the same time. We don't know exactly how it happened. I mean, what you're asking me is about how is the fossil record about unicellular beings 2.7 billion years ago, and say, crappy. We don't know much about it. But the way, whatever it happened, it was fast. And it's hard to figure out how it happened, because everything you need to have photosynthesis, to have respiration, to have this cytoskeleton, to have the internal membranes, to have the nucleus, that's all costs energy. Sex is very costly. So an organism like this spends much more energy than a bacteria. It has a much more complicated life cycle. And it should happen all the odds. Exactly how, don't ask me, nobody knows. I'm pretty sure people work in models about that. I'm pretty sure I know they do. But they kind of, we cannot test them. And being a widespread feature, I mean, about sex again, it suggests that may be an adaptive advantage. What's adaptive advantage? That's what we talk about selection all the time. Well, the idea is that selection actually restricts variation. You have a lot of variation. Some of them have more fitness than others. What happened is that natural selection will select the things that have more higher fitness to the cost of the lower fitness. So selection is about that. So okay, so if sex is so widespread, then it should be a good thing. Is that right? There has to be some adaptive advantage of having sex. Problem is, it's hard to know exactly what's that. One of the early attempts was done by this dude, August Weismann in 1889, and said sexual reproduction can also increase the difference between individuals. Such difference afford material by means of each natural selection that is able to increase or weaken each character according to the needs of the species. I told you that Amivula nativa probably have half a dozen strains. They're all the same. So there are not many variation there. And if you check another species from the same genus, those species occur in the sands, in the dune sands. And we have a lot of them in all Brazil. And nativa is asexual, but most of them are sexual. Okay? We have one also, although it's almost extinct because of the city of Rio. But anyway, that's a sexual species. There's a lot of variation, much more than nativa. So the question is, perhaps that's the idea. If you have a sexual species, the DNA is combined. I mean, you are what you are because you are a combination of the DNA of your father and your mother, and so on. So there's a lot of combination. While those species have only the DNA of their mother that's exactly the same of the grandmother and so on. So the idea is good. It makes sense. You just have a problem. Although it's possible that sex evolved to generate variation, sex not necessarily increase variation. Yes, there are reasons to believe that. Look at this. I hope you remember high school. Okay.
What's his size?
Let's see, there's genotypes here. You remember this? The all caps, it's dominant, and small caps means there's a recessive. You remember that? Okay. And here we have somehow some equilibrium. Of course, you have the heterozygote. It's more common than both of those guys here. And selection happens by somehow. What usually happens in nature is that somehow the environment changes. And with the environment change, selection changes. Because if you have been adapted to live in such a condition, let's say global warming will heat up things and things will be much warmer. If you're a guy that doesn't deal well with heat, you screw it, easily. So the environment changes and the selection changes too. So before selection, we have this proportion of those holotypes here. And fitness, showing here, it tends to help this guy here. So after selection, you imagine those AA here will be in much better shape. What happens is that if you have a sexual reproduction, that's exactly what happens. However, if you have sexual reproduction, and because your parents are exchanging DNA all the time, that never happens. What happens is that the other types receive a little bit of this one here because of the combinations. So that's a case in actually the variability decrease because of sex. So we have to have this in account. And that's not the only problem. Variation through sex often reduce fitness. Another slide. Oh God. Now the fitness curve is a little bit different. Okay, here it goes. And after selection, of course, the heterozygote will be much more popular because okay, it's selected for him. Fine. And you have a sexual selection. Again, you'll be in a great place. However, if you have sex and you exchange your DNA with other individuals, what happens is that the most fit type doesn't become as popular as it should be if it was sexual. So you can see sex can also reduce things. So how we take this? Well, one thing is that selection varies with time. I told you. I mean, right now, if you look at any study that people have done in the 70s about community ecology, it's a funny thing about that, because they all talk about the selection. Oh, this thing is about being selected because of this or not. That's bullshit. The reason is why, and most of the time, everything is perfectly fit to the environmental conditions of today. What we don't know are the environmental conditions of the past. That's the hard thing to ask because we don't have this data. So, but we know that it varies with time, and we are the product of selection from the past, not selection today. And what happens is that sex is good to break genetic association created by the past selection that are not favored anymore. So, if you're a product of the past and you have selected to have the current genotype, you're doing good. But then the environment changed by some reason. Let's say global warming is a good one, and become much warmer. You just become less fit because of that. So you're holding the wrong cards in your hand. You have to get rid of those cards as fast as possible. If you are a sexual species, you're out of luck. Because the way that you change your cards by mutation, and my God, that's very slow. However, if you're a sexual species, you shuffle your cards between the individuals. So new combination of cards will appear in your hand all the time. And perhaps some of those combinations are great for the new environment. So sex can be very helpful if you do your model taking the, assuming that the the selection will vary with time, which actually happens. Also, there is the famous red queen hypothesis for evolution of sex. You all remember Alice on Wonderland. Actually, this is through the mirror, I think. And what's the red queen hypothesis? It's good because of parasites. The red queen in Alice, there is a part, I think it's the mirror, through the mirror, that Alice runs through a maze and the red queen goes after her. But they never, the queen never gets Alice and Alice never escapes. You remember this part? I don't remember correctly, but I think it's that. And the funny thing is that if you have parasites, they are in a kind of an arms race. But what happens is that you try to bust your defense against the parasites. And the parasite by themselves, they're also trying to get better against you. So if you're a sexual species, again, your genotype changes very slowly. So parasites can easily adapt to whatever you have. Again, if you are a sexual species, it's easier to change your genotype configuration to the parasites. So the parasites have a harder time to get after you, so it could be good for that. And in fact, they test this using some snails. Funny thing is that the snails are facultative. They can be sexual or asexual. So the guys did an experiment, and they separated the sexual from the sexual ones. They subjected them for some experiments for, I think, 20 generations or something like that. And they showed the red queen hypothesis works very well. If exposed to fast mutating parasites, the whole species which have sex do much better than the species that are sexual.
Ronaldo, just one question before
Sure.
the previous slide.
Yep.
So when you say that sex is effective against parasites, you're assuming that the reproductive time of the parasites is comparable to the host.
Well, when I have the situation of host and paradise, we have what we call coevolution. They evolve together somehow. You see, one in response to the other. So what happens is that parasite becomes more efficient, and the host usually tries. Don't forget, I mean, there are parasites that are symbiotic organisms. We're talking about parasites. It's like the tick that go to your skin and suck your blood.
Right, but
The tick is very happy to suck your blood because it costs little to him. He just, attach it to your skin, it bite you somehow and suck your blood. You are not satisfied with this arrangement, so you try to get the tick out. And it's hard to get the tick. I mean, if you don't have tools or something like that, imagine a cow. Oh, it's very difficult for a cow to get rid of the tick. Okay, you can scrub and things like that. I guess most people here have the idea, have the experience of a tick. I mean, you cannot pull this thing out because it bites you. If you do that, it will be painful, and probably you leave some of the fangs there, and you inflammate. Is a bad idea.
Sure, but that's not exactly what I'm asking. What I'm asking is that, okay, so there's a tick comes and bites you. So I said, okay, I gotta stop this. So I go have sex.
No,
my descendant will have a better, suppose it has a better protection against the tick. But meanwhile,
No, it's not
the
like-
tick said, this cannot happen, I'll have sex faster.
No, no, no.
So he
no.
goes and he says he has like 200 generations of, of possible adaptations.
Let me do another example. Let's say you're a bacteria. Bacteria is asexual, okay? And there's a parasite, a virus of some sort. It starts inside you. And oh my God, this is heaven. And reproduce using your resource. And the bacteria is not very happy about that, if bacteria can be happy about anything. But anyway, the virus there is pretty good shape. The bacteria is not. Bacteria is being asexual. It evolves very slowly because it cannot shuffle the DNA. I mean, there is evolution. There's not mutation.
Okay.
There is other methods.
So-
there is vertical transmission. There are a lot of stuff.
So you're saying that
I'm simplifying. I'm
a
simplifying.
sexual host could have an advantage against an asexual person.
Exactly, because a sexual host can shuffle DNA with other individuals.
Okay.
And by luck, some of those, I mean, like in a poker hand, you can start very poorly, but if you shuffle some cards, it can become great. You see? That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And generation about generation, I mean, evolution can be faster if you're sexual. And the break-clean hypothesis is good because that's one we can test, and we did, and it works. It's cool. Not as common as I like it to. I think I made some mistake here. Okay. Another thing is that selection varies over space. You see, I told you that selection is kind of the environment take on the genotype, so the phenotype. So if selection varies in space, migration can cause some genetic association to be locally detrimental. Okay, you were having good shape with your phenotype, and then you moved someplace else. And then you're not as good as before. You see, my European ancestors moved to Rio de Janeiro, and my white skin now is detrimental. A chance of having cancer much bigger than yours. So I'm not particularly well adapted for here. In such cases, again, sexual species can quickly break the deleterious association by crossing locals with migrants, which actually happened in most of the colonization done by humans. And finally, rates of sex vary among individuals. It's the funny thing. And in many organisms, sex become more common if they are in poor conditions. That can be done with yeast and the kind of organisms, simple organisms. They can choose to be sexual or they can go asexual. And the funny thing is that if you stress them, they go sexual. What seems to happen is that under stress, their phenotype is not exactly a good match for the environment, so they use sex as a strategy to change quickly in a few generations to have a different kind of phenotype, and perhaps it will help them out. Again, we cannot test this, but we can check this. This actually happens. At stressful conditions, most asexual, facultative species they would probably choose to be sexual. Even paying the more energy you need to have sex. And finally, populations are finite. I mean, most of those models were done in the past. They did just infinite population. That become easy. When you have a finite population, we have to take care about a lot of stochastic processes. And what's going to happen is that in many cases, good genotypes are lost during stochastic process because this happens with finite populations. And if you have, again, sexual reproduction, you can get those genotypes back. That's cool. So you lost this generation, but it can regain it quickly. Just have the right cards. So what happens is that sex probably it's good because a combination of all those factors. You cannot say that really that the sex itself increases variation, but we can say that the shuffle of genes that sex causes creates the possibility of quicker evolution, and under right circumstances that be desirable. And that's what we believe today, that's what happens. So let's talk about now sexual selection. I told you that Darwin talked about that. Sexual selection is a special case of natural selection where mating success is favored instead of fitness. Okay, there is it might be complicated here because we define a fitness about descendants, But now we're not talking about ascendancy, we're talking about mating itself. So that's the point, that you don't care what happens, you just want to have sex. And there are two kinds of sexual selection. One is, members of one sex create a reproductive differential by competing among themselves for opportunities to mate. Which means that usually those are males. Males, you know, they compete one against the other, trying to get laid. That's what happens. And that comes in several ways. Ritual male combat is one of those ways. This 2 years, the antelopes are just fighting. This fight is ritualized. They usually don't go so aggressive. They're very aggressive, but they don't hurt themselves too much, because that also costs a lot of energy. And can be more subtle. This photograph is from a friend of mine. You see, there is a female snake here. Actually, see this one here. And there are a lot of males, there are 3 of them, they're trying to get the female. And they engage in a sort of ritual combat, and they try to get the better position one than the other. And in this case, it took about 30 minutes. After a while, the female looked at us and say, "Hey, what are you guys looking?" And she left. So we have to interpret this. But anyway, it's just cool. That's happening all the time. And also, you can have sperm competition. You see, some sperm can be faster than others. And that's also sexual selection. That's particularly important. I feel like this is only important if you female have sex with more than one male. And that happens a lot, even in the human species. And the sperm can live for a few days. So it happens that in the female, you can have sperm from several males. And then it's kind of advantageous if you have a very fast sperm, or if you put more quantity of sperm. There's a lot of stuff about sperm competition. I'm not talking much about that. But I told you there are 2 different kinds of sexual selection. And the other ones is that members of one sex create a reproductive differential by choosing. That's what happens with females. In the end, the females are the ones that pick the males, or at least it should be. So that can cause some weird propositions like sexual dimorphism in Schiphophoros. I think Mario can talk much better about this thing than me. But those fishes, they have these weird tails here. We call it swords. And it seems that females kind of enjoy those swords. So what happens is that this one here, I don't think is that bad. Mario can talk about that. There are ones that have a much bigger sword. Is that right? But I couldn't find a good picture. This one I found. So they kind of, the females select the ones that have a bigger sword, and they go mate with them. So that's an interesting proposition. And what the male does with the sword, I mean, they kind of, they don't seem to be very good to swim, you know? And just to finish this, the concept of sexual selection was not very well received by the Victorian society, you know? I think they don't like the idea that the female will pick up the male. I think this will not sit cool with them. And Wallace was one of the main critics. I have to say that Wallace, somehow, they those the critics after Darwin's death. I don't know, perhaps respect this guy. And he accepted competition against male, but reject the concept of female choice, as I told you. And
Wallace was more conservative, no?
I guess so.
Yeah.
But just not to take Darwin from the hook, he also said that man has ultimately become superior to woman. So those are men of their times. And funny thing is that some feminists from the time, I mean, early feminists already denounced them by that. Anyway, sexual selection was kind of not seriously taken until the 30s. In the 30s, Fisher introduced the concept of Fisherian runaway, which described how sexual selection accelerates the preference for a specific ornament. What he said is like that: remove the fish with the long tail, the short tail. What happens if you're female? They like the short tail. They will probably mate with a male that has a long tail. That's fine, and it's because of that. It's likely that any son this female have also will inherit his father's long tail. And the daughters will also inherit the preference for long tails. What happens is that you create a positive feedback, and after a while, you have males with enormous tails. If I recall correctly, Mary can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they found out that the preference for long tails actually exists even in species that have no tail at all. No short tail.
That's right, yeah.
That's right.
It's weird. Yeah.
It's weird, but that's happened a lot in sexual selection. We find out that females like the short tails, even in species that don't have the short tail. So, well, if I could advise those males, say, find out a sword of some kind, and you probably do well. So this concept was introduced by Fisher in the 1930s. And then things start more interesting. And he used the example of the widow bird, which has this ridiculously long tail. I'm no aeronautic engineer, but I'm pretty sure this doesn't help this bird's flight. And recently, there is a renewed interest in sexual selection and proposal of new theories. And I'll not talk about even the sexual selection in human beings. Psychologists love that. There's a lot of theories about that. But I know psychologists are going to say some BS. Well, the handicap principle. I want to talk about things that was raised in the 90s from the 90s to today. The handicap principle suggests males with a serious handicap that survives to age of reproduction. You know what? The female can look at that. Look at that. This guy is all screwed, and still he survived until to reproduction age. So perhaps there's something very good about it. It's kind of funny that the fact that there's a handicap, it signals actually that he has strong fitness. And experiment shows that females actually do that. It's kind of interesting. The chase away theory that proposed the evolution of exaggerated male display characters based on antagonist coevolution between sexes. Actually, in some cases, the female start thinking that the male is too much. I mean, look at the birds with those long tails. They sometimes say, look, I'm tired of those long tails, you know? And what happens is that the males start developing even longer tails because they overcome the rejection by overstimulating the females with even longer tails. This is the chaseway theory. Also, we can check out some species that happens. Finally, there's the idea of sexual selection as protection of extinction, because sexual selection is efficient for removing undesirable traits from the population. This is pretty brand new. They actually doing for models more than anything else, but also they use some beetles to that. And they show that natural selection, they change the condition of the beetles, they raise the beetles for 20 generations, and they show it by sexual selection. Females pick up beetles, we have better characteristics for the new conditions, and in the population that showed strong sexual selection, the survivability was much higher than the populations that showed low sexual selection. This is all done in a lab, of course. And finally, there's a sensory exploitation, which the male traits can provide sensory stimulation females find hard to resist. That's probably what every perfume maker is trying to do. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Meet the Tungara frog. I used to have an audio file, but that corrupted my slide presentation yesterday, so no audio file to you guys. But the idea of the Tungara frogs is that they have a specific call. And what happens is that in many amphibians, the Tungara frog is an example of that. It's something you would call a lack. Usually, in several species, the female show their prowess by defending something. They just can beat up any competitor by physically beating up, or they can find some better place and say, look, this is my territory, and my territory is superior to the other guy. So I'll stay here and you come here, baby, because this place is better. That's something they do. The Tungara frogs do what we call a lack. They just spread the environment. The environment is kind of dual. They don't protect anything. They don't fight each other, so they're just there. What they do there is that they sing. They have the mating call, and the mating call attracts the female. And there's a lot of things that you can check with this. I mean, if they make call very high or very low, it may be more or less attractive. They can use more energy and just sing louder. And that also is good, because if you sing louder, you know, the females have a better chance to listen to you and not the male that's in the corner. Although the bats also hear them, and they go there and predate those frogs. So you have to, you know, find an equilibrium there. And the call of this particular frog is described as being a wine chuck. And I'm going to butcher this now because, you know, the audio file didn't work. But basically, the males do something like wine chuck, something like this. And the funny thing is that some species close to this one just do the wine no chuck. And what the guys discovered in the 90s is that the females love the chuck. The chuck is a great hit there. It's topping the billboards, and the females just go to the frogs that do the best chuck. And the funny thing is that you can take this audio file and take the other species, and then you modify the file and create a chuck there. And show that the females of this species that don't have any chuck in their call. And when you play the playback with the chuck, the females go crazy. Oh my God, chuck, that's great. And they go all this. So again, like the fishes, even if the male in that species, particular species, don't know the chuck, the females already like it. They never listen to it, but they already like it. So that's the wine chuck. So males are exploiting this female, bridge. And I have a case study about that. That's one of my students did. It's about a frog called Physiolaemus signifer. Well, it's a common space from Rio. If you ever, you're astronomers, you like things that are very far from here. We're biologists, we like things that are close to home. And especially if we can do this in the city of Rio, even better, because we don't have to go far. And this is a very common species. You may have seen it. Physiolaemus signifer. Also, I took out the audio file because it was screwing up the presentation. And what he did is, this is a PhD thesis by Marcus Bilacci, and he done field work mainly in Magé between 2009 and 2011, and the experiments are done in the museum close by here. Let's start with the boring stuff. He did a lot of field work. He spent 2 years going every week there, and discovered that it was pretty boring. The females have not a bias for heavier males. That easily happens. If you have a bigger male, if you think, oh, the big males. The ladies like the big males. Not this one. They couldn't care less. No such difference. Also, we check out the coupling, because you can do experiments and present the female with choices, and also you can take the coupling. You go to the field and find every single couple there and see if the bigger males has some advantage, and there's all this, nope, nothing. Also, we find no difference in size, mass of all the singer and satellite males. What's happened is that if every single frog starts singing the chorus, you have cacophony. And probably the female will not find anybody. So what happens is that a few frogs sings, and the other frogs just stay there. Okay, I'm here. This guy's singing, but I take business too. Those are called the satellite frogs. And there's no difference also, because of course the singing frog receives more attention.
So can I ask you something specific?
Sure.
Just curiosity. So suppose I have a bunch of frogs that sing, they go, but the female cannot see them, only hear them. So if they get close to them, how does she know who's saying what?
They have good audition. They don't have as good vision.
Sure. So but they heard from far away.
Actually, those things don't see much, if you want to know. They have very poor vision.
Okay.
But we human beings have this vision bias, because the human vision is actually very, very good. So,
no, I understood that. But suppose you have 50 frogs singing males, singing this square leader, and the female is like 2 kilometers away. She's hearing this, and then...
2 kilometers away, you would stretch a little bit.
So she said, well, I heard that guy, the Elvis Presley, and then she comes in and says, well, how the hell do I know which one was it?
Well, because
They keep singing.
They keep singing.
Gets closer,
Well, I say that we always have the Elvis, but anyway, she'll pinpoint out it and go for it.
So in any case, this question is just trivial. So I had one that's a little more, perhaps, I have more doubts about it. So is there any evidence, because it seems like the sexual selection process is random.
No. The females know what they're doing.
It could be the size of the tail, it could be a horn that grows 2 meters
Well,
high.
look,
it could
those
be-
are the things that we can
but-
find out.
But you cannot predict what.
Oh, of course not.
Right, so that's different from natural selection, where if I get the average temperature of the Earth and I decrease
Look,
by
I can
50
observe.
degrees.
I can observe what females are doing, but I cannot, speculate whatever may happen later. I mean,
Right, but suppose that we get the global warming gets the Earth to be completely covered by water. You can have an idea of what type of changes natural selection would refer, right?
yeah, you can speculate
You
that.
can more or less you can more or less have an idea of what, eyes have been developed by many different species independently, right? Wings, things like that.
Yeah.
So the sexual selection apparently is completely random. It can be anything.
Well, the idea is sexual selection is that females,
Sorry, fitness indicator. The fitness indicator
Oh, okay.
can be anything.
the fitness case can be anything, but the idea of sexual selection, for the most part, is that female are choosing that particular male that exhibit this trait because she thinks that this trait is a good indication of fitness.
Yeah, but she thinks there is no reason for that. It's a random, it's an unknown mechanism.
Well, what happens that the males, not the males, I mean, what happens is that they can be wrong because you can say that the bird with the very long tail, it suffers to fly with this thing, but they fly, they do fly. I should have found a picture of that flying. I'm saying, but they can still fly
I'm not
even
being
with
very
this
clear.
thing.
Suppose you have a fish. This fish is a mutation and came with a tail this big, also came with a new horn that is this big, and with 3 eyes.
That's a Pokemon.
So the female, but the female decides to go for the 3 eyes and not for the other 2. This process is random. That's what I'm asking.
We don't know.
So it can be completely random. There's nothing that.
We
Not
don't know.
necessarily it is. Sometimes they exploit some kind of neural tendency to do something. For example, many birds like very big eggs, the female.
Yes.
So if she has many eggs to choose from, she'll try to sit on the biggest one. So this is programmed, because
Yeah.
that has been selected.
It's
as a
like the chuck.
But that goes on forever. There's no limit. So if you put an egg this big, she'll try to sit on top of that egg, even if it's an absurd egg, because she's programmed to choose the biggest.
Yeah, that's a.
So is that
That's a
can
kind
go
of
into
flaw.
sexual selection and this kind of thing, really into things that are
It's-
apparently absurd.
Yeah.
But they have a core that triggered the whole process that was actually related to some form of fitness, real fitness, not just sexual fitness.
Okay.
But then exploited in some way. Sexual selection exploit those things. So sometimes there can be advantage, sometimes not. I mean, the chuck in the frog song, as far as I know, it means anything. Not means anything, but still, they're pre-selected to like the chuck by somehow, and that's it. The tail in the fish or in the bird, it can actually, after a while, it can be deleterious. I mean, the fish can have a hard time swimming, and the bird can barely fly with those things. But still, the females in the beginning, probably, what happened is that the tail was an indication of strength, and after a while, it becomes just ridiculous,
It's a runaway process.
Exactly. But it's one of the process called the fish sharing runaway because of this. Okay? You see, I mean, if you're fit, I mean, Renato, if you're fit, if you go to the gym, you become fit, that's advantage. Females can be attracted by that. But some people just get crazy nuts and go for bodies that doesn't have any related thing in nature, so it become pointless after a while. You have no relation with fitness at all. So let's back to the Philadelphus. We find no difference between the preference between different in size of the singular and the satellites. Then we go to the lab, and that's what we did. We kind of shitted on the females. We processed the sound and make a lot of interesting experiments. Let's show what we didn't found. We put the chuck in the call. just for check. And they couldn't care less. So, no great. We change the tone also. We can make it, can change the pitch to become higher or lower. And again, females didn't care. And finally, we change the duration of the calls. We extend the loop because those calls are kind of repetitive, so we can just take the sound, the sampling of the sound, and can prolong the calls. And also, again, they didn't care a lot. That proves that we don't know anything about female preference, especially in frogs. But after a while, we find something. If you make the call with more repetitions, they like it. And also they like it louder calls. So we turn up to 11, the volume, and they like it too. So we finally find what they like too. So they like the louder calls. The louder calls is kind of dangerous because, as I showed in the slide, there are bats here also, and they like frogs too. So if you're a frog and you start singing too loud, you give an easy time to the bats to find that out. However, you can do a call with more repetitions. And the females love it too. And we have now, if you want, I mean, they didn't want to go further this, we have checked out in populations and figure out which males that actually have longer calls, and individuals have longer calls, and see if they have better fitness than the ones that have shorter calls. But, you know, the problem is the PhD students that they go away. but we can find in the lab that they really love those repetitions. And I think I overed my time, so I'll talk a little bit more this. Oh, this is the physiological significant mating. So the guy finally has female. And I want to thank Marcus Bilat, that was a PhD student who did the work, and Renato Feios took the picture of the snakes, although he owns me the color picture that he gave me. Anyway, and I would take some time now for answering some questions. I'm sure I'll not have 10 more.